Chapter 16. Misfit Shoes. "A pipe must have burst," Nancy cried out. "Oh dear, I wish I'd brought the key. We must do something fast." Mr. Drew decided to break a window pane and crawl inside the house. Ned offered to do it, and Nancy's father nodded. "But go around to the back where the break won't show," Mr. Drew suggested. Ned dashed off with the rest of the group following. As if about to punt a football, Ned made a run of several feet, lifted his right foot, and aimed it at a kitchen window. Crash! Ned reached inside, opened the latch, and raised the window frame. He pulled himself through the opening and unlocked the rear door. The others trooped inside. Nancy, making sure she was standing in a dry spot, clicked on the kitchen light. Less than 2 feet away, water was slowly flowing toward her. The faucets in the sink had been turned on full, and water was pouring out. It was spilling over the edge and cascading onto the floor. George jumped forward and turned off the faucets. At once, a search for the intruder began. Mr. Drew called out, "Don't touch any switches if you are standing in water." "I won't," Bess assured him. "I don't want to be electrocuted." Water had already flowed into the other first-floor rooms. It was also spilling down the stairway. Bert and Dave rushed up to shut off faucets in the bathrooms. "Ned, let's look for the main valve and turn off the water," Nancy suggested. "I think it may be in the utility room." The two dashed into the room adjoining the kitchen. They found that the faucets in a sink and a laundry tub had also been opened. Ned closed them while Nancy looked for the main valve. She located it and turned off the flow. When everyone assembled in the living room to compare notes, each declared he had seen no sign of the intruder. "I guess he escaped by the front door before you got there, Nancy," Bert stated. Bess gave a great sigh. "I'd say we have an all-night mopping job ahead of us." Dave grinned at her. "You forget I'm mop-up man for the Emerson football team. It won't take long. Let's go." Every broom, mop, and rag in the house was put to use. George and Bert found a couple of electric fans and plugged them in. "Operation Dry Out is in good hands," Mr. Drew said with a grin. He and Mr. Billington returned home ahead of the young people. The front light was on. As the two men walked up to the door, Mr. Drew bent down and picked up a shiny object. "What is it?" Mr. Billington asked. "A key. Someone must have dropped it." Mr. Billington took the key. "This isn't ours," he said. "Why, look, it has the letter W cut into it." "W?" Mr. Drew repeated. "Do you suppose it could stand for Webster? Maybe this is the key Nancy hid. Someone may have stolen it, then had no opportunity to replace the key, so he left it here." When the men entered the house, Mr. Drew told Hannah Gruen about the find. "That's strange," she said. "Nobody has come here this evening except the Rosardos, and they've been in their room all the time." "Nancy hid the Webster key in her raincoat pocket," Mr. Drew remarked. "I'll get it," Hannah offered. Mrs. Gruen was gone only a couple of minutes, then returned holding the key. They compared it with the one Mr. Drew had found. It matched exactly. "Queer things happen every day," Hannah remarked. "I wonder what will be next." Mr. Drew did not answer. He went to the telephone and spoke to the police captain about the flooded house and the key he had found on the doorstep. The officer promised to send a couple of men to the Webster house immediately. Over at the soaking wet home, the mopping up operation was almost finished. Nancy and Ned searched the house but found no clues to the intruder. While they were still hunting, the police car came in. Nancy spoke to the two men. "The intruder must have had a key to this house," she said. The police identified themselves as Needham and Welsh. They told of Mr. Drew's having found a key with a W on it near the Billingtons' front steps. Nancy and Ned looked at each other. Had Scarlett dropped it? Or perhaps Anton? As she and Ned walked to the rear of the house with the two officers, Nancy beamed her flashlight toward the river. Suddenly she exclaimed, "I see some shoe prints!" They stepped forward to examine them. "The guy sure has big feet," Needham commented. "I think we should take plaster impressions of these." He requested his partner to drive back to headquarters for the equipment. Nancy knelt on the ground and examined the prints, which went toward the water. Did she imagine it, or were they wobbly looking, as if the person was unsteady on his feet? Or, Nancy thought, did the intruder deliberately put on shoes much bigger than his feet to disguise his size? He even took long strides, and that too could account for the wobbliness. She and Ned and Officer Needham followed the prints. Possibly the vandal had hidden a small boat among the bushes along the shore. The three made a thorough search, but the only boat around was the Billingtons. The officer stopped to look at it. "She's a beauty," he said. "It's a good thing that intruder didn't help himself to it." "It's locked," Ned said, "and I have the key in my pocket. Apparently the vandal escaped in his own boat." By the time the searchers had returned to the house, Officer Welsh had come back with the plaster cast kit. While he was working, Nancy and Ned took his partner through the house, pointing out the damage. The officer made a lot of notes and said the case would be put on the police blotter at once, and a search started for a tall man with long feet. Nancy mentioned her own theory about his wearing oversized shoes, and Needham was impressed. "That's an idea," he said. "I'll jot it down." Just then, Officer Welsh came in. He said he had completed his work, and if Needham was ready, they might as well leave. House lights were turned off, and the front door slammed shut. As Nancy and her friends trudged through the orange grove and down to the river, Bert remarked, "We boys didn't have to wait long after our arrival for some excitement." "It always happens," Bess added. "I vote that for the rest of the evening we forget about detective work." She had hardly said this when George and Bert, who had started ahead, cried out in dismay. "Our boat's gone!" George exclaimed. The others ran to the dock. They could not believe their eyes. Mr. Billington's motorboat had been securely tied, and Ned had locked the motor. "There's only one way it could have been taken," Nancy spoke up. "It was towed away." "By whom?" Dave asked. No one had an answer. A few seconds later, Bess gave one of her great sighs. "It's a long trek from here to the Billingtons' house." "It sure is," George agreed. "But let's get started." Nancy said, "You all go and ask Mr. Billington to call the police about the stolen boat. Ned and I will stay here a while. I want to hunt for clues to the thief." The other four hurried off. With her flashlight, Nancy searched for footprints. "Here they are!" she cried gleefully. The thief was the same person who was up at the house. Ned looked at her, puzzled. But how could he have been? We were down here after he'd gone, and our boat was still at the dock. Nancy pointed out that the man could have towed the boat away when the police and everyone else were in the house. Or he might have been hiding up the shore a distance, and a pal came to pick him up. Together, they tied Mr. Billington's craft to a motorboat and went off. Just then, they heard a motorboat in midstream. "Let's hail it," she said. "Maybe the pilot passed our boat." Ned shouted lustily. The pilot heard him and slowed his motor. He steered for the Webster dock and called out, "Somebody need help?" Quickly, Ned explained. The pilot said he had not seen the stolen craft, but added, "How about hopping in here and we'll look for it?" Nancy and Ned did not need a second invitation. As soon as the motorboat pulled up to the dock, they climbed in. End of chapter 16.